Okay. I'm doing this, and I intend for this to be my last live stream for this project, my second American civil conflict, internal conflict, Syrian style, as in factions, different factions fighting one another. Yes, this is going to be broken up into different segments within this one presentation because anytime I do these really long ones, I tend to run out of battery very quickly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be doing partly story, then I'm going to break it into the battle maps, then I'm going to, hey, Wild Animus, good to see you, great to see you, welcome. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a segment of story reading, then I'm going to, while I leave it on the charger, then I'm going to do the maps, and I'm going to talk about the economic, financial, and the atrocities, leave it on the charger, then I'm going to go back to the final battle maps. So that's how I'm going to break this up. So without further ado, this is part 4. Hey, Brogan, great to see you. Yeah, tell your mom I said hi, too. All right. When the multiple false flags and agitation propaganda, civil unrest, and rioting happening in many major cities, which began spreading to others, coupled with, and simultaneously even, partly a result of, the economic and financial collapse of the nation. With its food and fuel collapse, all coalescing into the leadership heads of multiple warring factions emerging from the shadows with their own plans, ideologies, systems, and armies to enforce the new paradigm as that which was crafted by the Western satanic banking elites began to melt away as their systems failed and their plans for a reset having had backfired as the globalist regime's armed forces largely disintegrated before their own eyes. This, as coups occurred on the national level, but also even at the local level. Units loyal to the regime numbered only some 400,000 remaining personnel in their respective units, along with another 300,000 paramilitary so-called national security forces, in quotes, comprised of the merging of all of the alphabet forces into one agency, one paramilitary force. Woke militias were raised up in the territories that remained loyal to the rogue globalist regime, as well as foreign refugee militias. These forces made up of third world immigrants who were illegally brought in and housed in refugee centers illegally by the rogue globalist regime, who began to go into the centers to find recruits that would fight for their cause. The leaders of the other factions had plotted and schemed, some for many years. They had sat quietly, observing, planning their next moves, as well as keeping in touch with friends and acquaintances in powerful positions of different varieties, sympathetic to their causes. Some factions were relatively tame, while others were not, even though they perhaps began with noble intentions. They had changed their course over time. with robust underground propaganda networks of their own that combined with their powerful allies and their own forces as well, and operating under the cover of the total collapse of the nation, all rapidly seized powers in their areas of influence, creating a new paradigm as ideologies that no one ever heard of before emerged from the shadows along with the factional leaders that led them. As food and fuel were in drastically short supply, the strongmen leaders of the factions promised their respective peoples a brighter future, in quotes, beyond the end of the war. It was a war that became the ending of many lives by the time it all ended and concluded. And a newer, uglier one would later begin via the rapid Sino-Russian invasion of the USA via their new hybrid war doctrines. Roughly some 35 million perished in the Second American Civil Conflict, mostly due to high civilian deaths due to starvation, also diseases of all types, and being caught in the middle of savage combat in the cities and towns caught up in it, involved, and of those caught between warring factions as well. An estimated 7 million deaths were due to combatant deaths out of that 35 million figure. Various fighting forces fed into the meat grinder of the war. Though the prior economy and intertwined financial system had collapsed, others arose to replace it in the different factional areas controlled by these different factions. Late into July, the conflict was now in full swing, with a number of major key battles in various parts of the land between multiple factions having had already begun and concluded, or were still going on, with more about to begin. Shortly before the war began, there was some roughly 1.2 billion barrels of all types of fuels in the entire land, including in various vehicles' fuel tanks. However, during the whole course of the war itself, specifically, only 840 million barrels would remain inside the then bone-dry nation. This takes into account all fuels by type, both available at the initiation of hostilities, as well as that which was able to be produced during the war itself. Upon the coup's occurrence, along with the rise of all the other powerful factions, the split in all available resources, facilities related to such as refining facilities, and more, only added to the causes of the conflict, along with the new paradigm arising of the various new extreme, although some more tame, ideologies that arose out of the shadows to seize control. By July 31st, the biggest faction by now in the land and population as well as its overall size of its forces, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front was badly oil hungry for new offensives its leadership of the Troika, along with their subordinates, now desired and needed to launch. They had the most enemies. They had the most enemies, along with the Mormon State, the regime, and also the Raza Narco State, as no one else wanted to seek alliances with these evil, barbaric factions, often opting instead for alliances against these factions, between the more tame factions. Texas had the most oil resources and refineries thereof, as well with the N.S.R.F, the second, and the Free American Army, the third, in oil resources and refining facilities, followed by all of the other factions, all of whom held puny reserves in comparison to the three aforementioned. Of the 840 million barrels throughout the conflict, Texas again had 185 million, with the N.S.R.F, National Salvation Revolutionary Front, having 151 million, and the Free American Army some 118 million barrels. And in the southern Gulf area, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front leadership had been busy accumulating powerful ground forces along this sector of the front, both to seize the main portion of the Free American Army's oil production areas in Louisiana, but in doing so, potentially weakening them enough to perhaps bring them to the peace table, perhaps leading to them ceasing to exist as a faction, which would knock out the second biggest overall faction and perhaps second overall strongest faction on the map itself out of the war, leaving the National Salvation Revolutionary Front to finish off the regime on its own, then have its final apocalyptic showdown against the Mormon State. Then, only then, the Troika had reasoned, would the rest of the factions give in and return to a USA ruled under the National Salvation Revolutionary Front as an ultra-nationalist, non-globalist, and secular humanist version of the United States of America, ruled by the Troika and their underlings of their leadership council. As I take you to the map, the area that was just being discussed was right here. Right here, inside of Mississippi, a battlefront had begun to form between the Free American Army, some of whose forces came from the local area in Mississippi, comprised of some of its National Guard elements, while the rest was comprised by some Louisiana forces who were also busy battling some of the regime elements in Fort Polk. They had recently just seized the Barksdale Air Force Base, with some of the B-52H Stratofortress bombers intact, which would actually become invaluable during this conflict. The National Salvation Revolutionary Front, for its part, had been building up forces right here in anticipation of driving to Jackson, Mississippi from Meridian along I-20, and then headed south to capture New Orleans and then the rest of Louisiana to incorporate its oil production into that of the Dakotas' large oil production, and potentially knocking the Free American Army here and here out of the war, as some of their largest oil production facilities would be out of commission and in the hands of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, which would add humongous supplies of oil for them to be able to launch further offensives to drive on the regime in the Northeast, as well as to later on finish off the regime islands and then take on the other biggest foe it had in the conflict, the M0rm0n State, which equaled the NSRF in terms of brutality and extremism, but in a theocratic way instead of a secular humanist way. But in preparation for the battle, I take you to that battle map. The total forces involved in this battle were some 48,000 forces of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, who were comprised of some recently armed with new weaponry Jolly Roger Death Brigade's forces in one division that they were able to accumulate in this area. Also, some of the new youth brigades of teenagers that were taken through the NSRF's prison system to teach them about treating enemies with brutality, as they were taken under the wings of the adult Jolly Roger Death Brigade guards and forced to participate in the atrocities regularly conducted in the extermination centers to desensitize them to killing other human beings. These were 14 to 17-year-olds, and they were raised up as child soldiers to be used by the National Salvation Revolutionary Front in vicious combat. As one of the Troika leaders, Albert Motufu, had said, they can pull the trigger without conscience, and they can kill among the best. Also, there were some of the core forces, as in CORE Corps, not CORPS, like the unit size, but the core forces of the NSRF, which was constituted of former combat veterans of the two previous wars, as well as some of the NSRF's military units that had defected to them. And some of these units were local guard units here in this specific area, as well as regular militias, which comprised most of the NSRF's actual fighting forces itself. As for the force composition of the Free American Army, which at this battle was trying to hold the front the best they could, as they had commitments elsewhere at the time of this battle. They had some 32,000 forces in the area that they could call upon, mostly consisting of constitutional militia, though they did have, which were also combat veterans, and some of them were trained by the armed forces that were not combat veterans. And they also had several actual local military units they could rely on, but most of which were lighter units. But the best units that they had were a special operations battalion that had once belonged to the Mississippi Guard, and also some aviation units consisting of a recon helicopter battalion of Kiowa helicopters, which can be armed with simple weapons, as well as some attack helicopter battalions of Apache longbow attack helicopters, which can carry more and heavier weaponry generally than the Kiowa could. But being that they had a short logistical train to their refinery facilities in Louisiana, it was fairly easier to keep these units fueled at the front than it was elsewhere, where they were much, much, much further from their supply chains of oil. So, these aviation units could perform some combat maneuvers. However, oil still had to be used very, very, very sparingly. It was a major crisis, as the goals of the N.S.R.F. had led to them accumulating potent strike forces in the Meridian, Mississippi area, seeking to strike west and then south, eventually to New Orleans, seeking to acquire the oil wealth and refineries of Louisiana along its Gulf Coast. Laying between they and their main objectives in the South were smaller, less potent Free American Army units equipped with far less heavy assets, apart from their very limited air power that was in Barksdale, and their Special Operations Battalion, and some mortars that equipped some of the constitutional militia forces who were trained in their use or had previous backgrounds as troops that served on mortar tracks, which essentially were the M113 APCs that were designed to accommodate the 81mm mortars. Now, taking you to the field of battle itself, this is a pretty straightforward battle. You have a Youth Killers Militia Brigade here, which is comprised of these 8 battalions of the Youth Killers Militia. Then you have this Jolly Roger Death Brigade's division of 16 battalions, which is 16 more thousand troops. Then you have these corps forces here that belong to the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team of the Mississippi Guard. Now, the Mississippi Guard had been roughly split down the middle between the National Salvation Revolutionary Front and the Free American Army, who had its Special Operations Battalion, as well as its Aviation Brigade, consisting of the 185th Aviation Brigade and its subordinate unit here, these battalions, the Recon, the 2 Attack Helicopter Battalion, and the Air Assault Infantry, who used helos to carry them into battle via air assault, and its headquarters. Down south, you had the Constitutional Militia Forces, who along I-20 held the line here near I-20 and the town of Brandon, trying to stop the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's heavy assault into and down I-20 to first reach Jackson, Mississippi, and then head straight south to capture New Orleans and the rest of the Louisiana region, to seize all the oil wealth and refineries, hopefully intact, as their commanders sought to do so. The rest of the forces were comprised of their regular militia, mostly held in reserve, though some were used in the main assaults here. When the battle initiated, what occurred first was that you had these militia forces here doing probing attacks against the lines, against some constitutional militias of the Free American Army forces, who managed to not only repulse, but utterly destroy these formations in heavy, heavy battle. Upon that ending, you had these constitutional militia here attacking this other prong of assault, which was done by the 1st of the 155th Battalion of the, it was an infantry of the, it was the 1st Battalion of the 155th Infantry Regiment belonging to the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team here, and the 150th Brigade Engineer Battalion, who launched an assault also into the lines. Around the same time this assault was destroyed and repulsed. These 5 constitutional militias here hit them on their flanks, but they were ready. They formed a sort of a salient here with their defensive lines, but they were attacked by the 2nd Special Operations Brigade, or the 2nd Battalion of the Special Operations Battalion of the 20th Spec Ops Group right here, formerly of the Mississippi Guard as well. So they fought their former compatriots right here in heavy battle, and did, with the help of the 5 constitutional militias, manage to eliminate them, who then regrouped and carried out their next attack into this line of militia forces here that was screening the buildup of the core forces of the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, the 2nd Jolly Roger Death Brigade's Division, and the Youth Killers militia forces, who were ready now for combat. About this time, the 2nd Battalion of the 114th Field Artillery Regiment had launched a savage bombardment of the attacking forces here, who attacked their militia lines to give their militia forces badly needed artillery support, which deteriorated into a long series of firefights and engagement with intermittent artillery shelling. And about that same time, the recon and the Support and Security Battalion had rushed into the area to probe and see what was going on in other parts of the line, to see if they could exploit some of the line and punch through. But that deteriorated into some tit-for-tat battles, and the Brigade Support Battalion ran out of fuel and largely had to ditch their helos right behind the battle line, while the recon element did pummel some of these militia forces, badly damaging them, but also likewise had to land their helos a little further back and fight on as infantry forces and hold the line. Now also, when this had occurred, the breakthrough, the attack helicopters and aviation infantry, 2 aviation infantry battalions and the 2 attack helicopter battalions had joined in hitting these forces here exceptionally hard, causing both the 1st of the 98th Cavalry, First Battalion of the 98th Cavalry Regiment to reinforce the militia lines here, along with the 1st Battalion of the 155th, who then rushed up here to reinforce the lines here, because the militia forces were being badly battered by the combo of the attack helicopters, not the recon and the other brigade support battalion up here, but the actual heavier forces of attack helos and aviation infantry that were dropped off to reinforce quickly the spec ops and the 5 constitutional militias that were trying to punch through here into a northeasterly direction. Now, in the center, what occurred was the Jolly Roger Death Brigades, who had participated in this prong here with the militias and were defeated, the rest of their brigade broke into 2 parts. One brigade went to Forest, the city of Forest, or the town of Forest rather, to stop 5 constitutional militias who were trying to attack, along with these repelled and defeated them and destroyed these 5 with the 4 Jolly Roger Death Brigade battalions here. And they moved along and stopped to set up a position here. As other elements, other 4 battalions of their brigade had moved down the interstate and set up position here, and the Youth Killers Militia Brigade forces here moved and established position here to ready an attack simultaneously in the south with these 3 militia forces right here, with these 2 being held in reserve to defend the town of Polkville, Mississippi, right here. Their plan was to punch through and seize I-20 so that there could be a smooth logistical route all the way to the city of Jacksonville, or the city of Jackson, Mississippi. And then they could proceed to the south. Reinforcing this move was the 106th Brigade Supply Battalion, which would be their logistical forces carrying the fuel, food, ammunition, and weapons needed for this big assault in the southern part of the battle. And with them came the 2nd Battalion of the 198th Armored Regiment, which is actually part of the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team as well. They, together, moved down to be the main breakthrough forces staying on I-20 the whole way, moving here to join with these Death Brigade 4 battalions guarding their northern flank as they were to make the breakthrough along with the Youth Killers Militia Brigade punching down in the far south, and these 3 militias punching in the center. With this last surviving brigade of the Jolly Roger 2nd Division's 2 brigades, this brigade was destroyed. So these 2 are the final surviving brigade of the Jolly Roger Death Brigade's 2nd Jolly Roger Division. They were to punch through in the center along with the armor. Or actually, I'm sorry, they were to punch through in the center and the north with the armor and guarding the flanks. So 4 battalions here and 4 here with the armored assault. Because remember, the Jolly Roger Death Brigades are a fanatical paramilitary element often used as breakthrough forces to punch holes in enemy lines. So what occurred was there was a Constitutional Militia's mortar battalion right here to give fire support to their other 3 compatriots in the area. Now, when the forces all attacked together, this huge amalgamation of forces I just showed you between the 2 brigades, the 1 brigade of the Jolly Roger Division and the other full brigade of the Youth Killers Militia Brigade, along with the Brigade Support Battalion to do logistics, as well as the Armored Battalion to help make the breakthrough attack. They did break through the lines. And it was such an emergency because this battle occurred. This battle occurred between July 31st and August the 2nd, that from nearby Barksdale Airport, 2 flights of 2 B-52H Stratofortresses were able to be used. The first sortie was in the north to help the forces on the front right here that were trying to effect a breakthrough to bomb these forces as they were becoming very powerful with their artillery support because they were beginning to suffer high casualties. But when this occurred, it was towards the end of the battle itself, on the 7th, which was the last day of combat, when these forces destroyed these battalions of Free American Army forces and had begun to make a break for the final defensive line There were no forces between the final line and Jackson, nor was there much on the way in the roads from Jackson to New Orleans that if had the forces of this element here that was gathered together actually effected a breakthrough here, they could have drove on all the way to Jackson. It would have opened up a road to Louisiana and would have been a crisis for the forces of the Free American Army, who were outnumbered in this battle by nearly a quarter of what their size is. Or I'm sorry, it was by nearly a quarter of what their size is, what the NSRF's forces' sizes were. They were outnumbered by basically a quarter. So what occurred was all available units were trying to stop the breakthrough, but the two strato fortresses made an overflight from Barksdale, which was close by, so they didn't have to use that much fuel, and they carpet munitioned all the forces along the attacking line right here, dropping heavy saturation munitions, just carpet munitioning the entire area, just saturating the area with all kinds of heavy munitions, just blasting the attacking National Salvation Revolutionary Front forces basically to dust, leaving not much left of the attacking forces. However, after this confrontation in the south and by I-20 here, from just north of I-20 all the way south of it, where the NSRF forces were beginning to make a breakthrough as they defeated the first line, they were about to finish off the second line when the emergency air power missions came in and basically annihilated them. So when the battle concluded, all things went back to the status quo, so to speak. So it was an 8-day battle. It lasted from the 31st of July to the 7th of August. So on the I'm sorry, bear with me, y'all. On the first sortie that was flown in the north, it was done on the 5th, closer to the end of the battle, but not quite, to sort of blunt the NSRF forces that were possibly going to actually defeat the attacking forces, which were the Spec Ops and the aviation forces and some of the constitutional militias that were attacking together. The NSRF forces were actually doing quite well there until the first sortie came in and carpet munitioned their lines and basically blasted much of their artillery and other heavy forces that they had in that immediate area to bits. And on the 7th, about the end of the battle, the last day of battle, right as the NSRF forces were about to punch through and actually break through and finish off most of the lines of the Free American Army forces in the area, the final two B-52s came through in one sortie. So there were two sorties of two. Two flew on the 5th, and another two flew on the 7th, and carpet munitioned the forces north of I-20 and south of I-20. So the results of this battle, essentially, was a stalemate and a return to the status quo on the Southern Front, meaning that all the forces on the Southern Front were equally badly battered, but they were back to their original starting lines, nobody really having had gained anything. So, the results are that a major crisis was averted. The key oil fields in Louisiana were still in the Free American Army's hands, prevented from being captured by very potent strike forces of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front in the region. The one major instance where air power proved the decisive factor in turning the battle, as opposed to the size and composition of the ground forces alone, or the weapons of mass destruction factor in the case of the chemical weapons used by artillery. The National Salvation Revolutionary Front very nearly came close to achieving a decisive breakthrough were it not for the two sorties, two bombers each, dropping their heavy ordnance on the battlefield. The N.S.R.F. was unable to use air power in the region, not because they didn't have it, but because they didn't necessarily have the maintenance technicians, the fuel available, or the spare parts available readily, because they had to cannibalize some planes to equip others. Because remember, the military-industrial complex in an internal conflict is not cranking things out anymore because nobody is really going to work. So they had to cannibalize other vehicles. And a lot of their air power, like I said in the previous 3 videos, the stars had to align in terms of the workers, the maintenance technicians, the the maintenance personnel, the POL products, hydraulic fluids, the electrical systems technicians, the different engineers that worked in some of these aircrafts and other such things. Everybody, even the ordnance technicians and specialists, had to be available. And the parts, if there was a part that was corrupted or wrong, it had to be fixed. So the NSRF, lacking the fuel, and they decided to budget instead their fuel for the ground offensive instead of an air offensive, not fully understanding that the Free American Army had taken Barksdale, as well as some of its bombers intact, with the personnel intact, with everything intact for them to work. At least 2 of them. And they were able to fly 2 sorties by battle's end, which saved the Free American Army's oil supplies. As remember, the Free American Army was embroiled in many, many other regions, such as against the regime forces and the Army of the Southeast forces here in Macon. They were embroiled in battle also against regime forces elsewhere. They were embroiled in battle against regime and Union of Southwest militias here, as well as building up on the Texas state line, because once they had defeated these islands of regime controls, such as Fort Sill and Lawton area, the Fort Riley, Kansas area, and Fort Polk area, they were going to build up and try to recapture Texas and bring it back into the fold. Now remember, Texas and the Free American Army were both very tame factions. They mostly observed Geneva Conventions. They mostly treated their people properly. And Florida as well, and the Army of the Southeast as well. And you could say the same for the Maine militia and the Northwest Conservative Army and the Union of Southwest militias. They were all relatively tame, and these are the neutral areas here with the slanted lines. But Texas wanted nothing to do with going back to America after they just became an independent nation. Same with Florida. They didn't want to go back. They wanted to be free. They didn't care if it was going to be under the constitution of this faction or what, but they wanted to be free. So that leads to the battles more in the Southwest when it comes to the Mormon State and what they've been doing, because I do these battles by the dates that they occur, because they're all broken down into time periods during the internal conflict. So, as I prepare to show you the next battle, this is going to be part of the Eastern Colorado campaigns that took place in Eastern Colorado here, when the Mormon State was busy trying to capture the last regime holdout areas in Colorado, because what had occurred was that they quickly had blitzed Colorado. They had taken control of Denver as their forces from Utah and western Colorado raced down the interstates and highways and seized Denver without much resistance, which enabled them to build up around the regime-controlled areas. It was important to the Leadership Council, which was the Council of Elders, and Supreme Acolyte Josiah in particular. It was important that Colorado be brought under the control of the Mormon state, under complete control, as the Pueblo area had even more WMDs that needed to be acquired at the Pueblo Army Depot, just as was done in Deseret with the seizure of their shells of nerve agents. It was to be done in Pueblo as well as the base facilities, Fort Carson and the other such areas. When they had took control of Denver, junior acolytes, which were basically generals in the Mormon state as they were on the Council of Elders, such as one being Acolyte Issachar, who created the Brigham Young Brigade, which initially seized power in Utah from the regime and took over the Mormon Church simultaneously and the state. Acolyte Issachar had been sent to lead the Called by the Faith forces. Supreme Acolyte Josiah had told Grand Acolyte, his right-hand man, Grand Acolyte Mordecai, to put Issachar under command, Acolyte Issachar, under command of the Called by the Faith forces. As the stream began to grow, or as the trickle grew to a stream of the Called by the Faith forces now coming in through the small sliver of Arizona and New Mexico here to reach training camps inside of Utah for the Mormon state militants, they began to reinforce their forces in a big buildup. This is after they've already had the almost apocalyptic struggle for Cheyenne, Wyoming. And some of those forces that were initially in the Cheyenne battle, now with a lot of combat experience, after the truce, the uneasy truce with the N.S.R.F., had been redeployed a little further south on I-25, as other forces came in from Utah and from the south as well, to build up for the big offensive that was coming. So essentially, in this battle, what had begun to occur was the forces of the Mormon state began to build up in eastern Colorado after having had seized the major roads and routes into Denver. And just south of Denver was Cheyenne Mountain, was the Air Force Academy, the Pueblo Army Depot, and Fort Carson. And this was to become a humongous campaign. After a 3-week siege and buildup period, the actual battle itself occurred between August the 4th and August the 7th. The total forces involved were 82,000 Mormon state forces and 20,000 regime forces fighting for dear life in the pocket. They were largely isolated and increasingly difficult to supply by air. Soon, supplies would stop coming entirely, as the regime just couldn't afford it. They just couldn't afford to keep them supplied. They just told them to do their best and hold out the best they could, because they were no longer able to supply them by air. This was due in part not only to the fuel issues faced by the regime everywhere, but it was also due to the fact that Mormon State now controlled the air also. Though they had very little fuel themselves, they used the radars at the airports, such as the Salt Lake City and Denver airports that were recently captured, being the Denver airport recently captured. They used the radars, the A7 radar, or I'm sorry, the A9 radar, being one of the more latest iterations of civil aviation radar, was used to great effect to catch all planes that were not capable of electronic warfare, to jam such radars. They were capable of seeing all types of cargo aircraft and other planes in their airspace. They still had a few dedicated Mormon air traffic controllers that would do the job of helping them to secure their airspace. The former Air Guard of Utah was now the Mormon State's Air Force. They did have several working F-16s that could be called upon to down any type of regime resupply flights or any regime incursions whatsoever. As in Part 1, if you remember correctly, after the Mormon State seized power and began to establish their militant and Mormon terrorist training camps, they began to launch radical vehicle assaults with suicide vehicles across the land. And these developed into a torrent of assaults. And the regime at the time used only 4 available that they had available A-10 Warthogs to strike some of these training camps with Maverick missiles and Hellfire missiles and other such air-to-ground munitions, and also strafing. But they utterly had failed when, doing attack runs, some of the militants had used Stingers to down the regime's aircraft. Only 1 flew back to safety. The other 3 were downed. One of the pilots managed to escape and evade and make it to safety, while the 2 others were captured and beheaded on video, where the video was sent out of the country due to the regime shutting down the internet. And the video was put onto Mormon State internet accounts that were outside the country, because the Mormon State had agents in other nations with Mormon populations. And these Mormon State accounts used the beheadings as propaganda to try to get more called by the faith forces to come and join the Mormon State. And it worked to great effect. Now in this battle here, the Mormon State was mostly concerned between the 4th and the 7th with seizing the city of Pueblo and its Army depot here. The Army depot contained stockpiles of sarin and VX nerve agent in the guise of 155 shells for artillery pieces, which the Mormon State had, because some of its Joseph Smith's own forces that were called Joseph Smith's own, basically the former military that were already heavily Mormon, such as the Utah Guard and other military units that converted and joined, they already had 155 artillery pieces, such as the former Utah Guard's 65th Artillery Brigade, equipped with 155 howitzers of the M198 varieties. So they were able to use these shells with great effect. They already had the shells they acquired at Deseret, and now they sought the shells from Pueblo. When the battle began, there were some major forces involved. Up here is Denver. They had totally blitzed and taken over Denver when they had used much of their fuel stocks to deploy their troops north and south to surround the regime, but north to capture the nukes at the Warren Air Force Base, which had just recently been captured by the National Salvation Revolutionary Front from the regime, which led to the near-apocalyptic showdown between the 2 most radical elements on the map, the Mormon State and the N.S.R.F. being 2 of the most radical, aside from the regime and the much, much smaller Raza Narc0 State. So the called by the faith forces organized into the first called by the faith corps, not corps as in C-O-R-E, but the unit size of about 32,000. So there were 32,000 foreign volunteers of the called by the faith forces right here. And then there was the 1st Joseph Smith's own division, of which the 65th Artillery Brigade, it was at this battle, had been deployed here and joined together with the 2nd Battalion of the 135th Aviation, which was a Colorado Guard battalion which had defected and joined the Mormon State via conversion, as well as Joseph Smith's own infantry battalions that were put together by combat veterans that were Mormon combat veterans, as well as even a Joseph Smith's own horse and camel cavalry battalion, which had separate elements of horses and camels because they couldn't put horses and camels in the same companies. But they acquired their camels by taking them from camel farms, private camel farms that donated the animals, and private horse farms in Utah, ranches that donated their animals to form this unit. They also had technicals equipping their Joseph Smith's own forces, stolen M0rms from armories, even some tanks and Bradleys, so on and so forth. Then there was the 1457th Engineer Battalion, which was also of the forces that had been up there. It was also of the Utah Guard, of the forces that had been up at the battle with the NSRF forces. Then there was many regular militias that were spread all throughout and around in a crescent formation, with the foreign volunteers coming down from the Denver area and the Joseph Smith's Zone coming from also the Denver area, but in a northern and a southern crescent, to take control and had laid siege to the military areas of Cheyenne Mountain, the Air Force Academy at Colorado Springs, the base, the Army installation of Fort Carson, Colorado, and the Pueblo Army Depot, of course, nearby. So the first moves of the battle was massive artillery shelling by the Joseph Smith's own forces of the 65th Utah Guard Artillery Brigade, whose artillery battalions shelled relentlessly the regime forces, hitting this National Security Battalion, which was paramilitary for the regime, hitting this 4th Combat Aviation Brigade, which belonged to 4th ID, who is now stationed at Carson. They used to be at Fort Hood when I was at Fort Hood, but now they're at Carson. They also hit other forces, while the regime tried to hit back, as they did have their artillery shells, of course, that were at Carson, but they had regular shells, largely, such as the HE varieties and the RAP rounds, which are rocket-assisted projectile rounds, which they launched at the militias that were up in the mountains coming down, and the engineers and these militias here, as well as this militia here. They launched their HE and rocket-assisted HE rounds at these forces here. And also at later assaults by these forces coming up here. They have surrounded, in their race to Pueblo, they surrounded and destroyed this National Security Forces battalion. They flanked them as these forces, the first moves were these Called by the Faith forces here, these 2 battalions of the Called by the Faith 1st Corps, and these 3 militia battalions here linked up and closed the encirclement, and then outflanked this the National Security Battalion, and these 3 militia battalions struck from the front and utterly surrounded and annihilated them in heavy battle. And then they moved and established a defense or an offensive front right here, intending on moving in and attacking the forces of the 4th ID, who consisted here of the 1st Stryker Brigade Combat Team and the 3rd Armored Brigade Combat Team. And the 4th ID's artillery regiment right here was continuing to try to offer artillery support. But it was too late, as these 2 forces of militia, these battalions, moved in and seized the Pueblo Army Depot with its nerve agents and other associated weapons and munitions. And these 4 right here surrounded and accosted and assaulted and destroyed in heavy conflict this NSF battalion, this National Security Forces battalion, before moving and establishing a defensive line here for offense later, along with the line established here against these same forces I had just mentioned earlier, these two brigade combat teams of the regime. Now, while this was going on, these forces, these two militia forces, raced to secure I-25 to control logistical routes to the north and south, from the south of the entire encirclement. These two battalions right here moved in and began to get into combat in the town of Pueblo with the actual artillery regiment of the 4th Division of 4th ID, and was helped by the 2nd Infantry Brigade Combat Team, who moved into the south because the artillery guys were being diverted from their actual artillery missions, and that was bad for the whole overall operations of the regime, because now they were no longer getting artillery support, as their guys were being attacked inside of Pueblo and around it. So they had to move to the south, east, to help them, and established a line here along with them to take some of the pressure off of them so that they could go back to their artillery missions. But while that happened, these forces here, the engineers, the combat engineers, and these two militia forces, came down the mountains and struck and hit on the flanks and hit them hard. And up north, as the artillery continued to rain down, these Air Force Academy recruits were hastily formed into a combat battalion and armed by the regime, as they needed all hands on deck, as their forces were in big trouble. And the Air Force Academy was right here. While that occurred, these called by the Faith Forces attacked them in a heavy frontal assault with artillery support from a battalion of the Joseph Smith's own Utah 65th Artillery Brigade. And these 5 attacked and utterly annihilated them before swinging around to help attack this surrounded National Security Forces battalion who's fighting for their lives, as well as to help surround these miscellaneous mixed units of military, both Air Force and from the Academy and from Cheyenne Mountain, that had retreated to the regime's pocket, as well as Army units as well. It was a mixed unit area here, sort of like the Air Force Academy recruits being used and armed due to an emergency and the collapse of the battlefront. As that was going on and the artillery shelling from the Joseph Smith's own hit this National Security Forces battalion, the Horse Cavalry Battalion of the Joseph Smith's own forces, which were the combat veterans of the prior wars that rode horses and camels into battle, the head acolyte of this battalion and his bishops, which are like the captains, they all rode down in their horses and camels and struck viciously against this surrounded battalion of the paramilitary for the regime. And then they raced and hit these miscellaneous units who were not expecting them at all. And they hit them who were busy trying to relieve these guys here. They were busy trying to help them who were surrounded. They were hit by the horse cavalry that rode on in and began to basically annihilate them in firefights as they were basically utterly surrounded and being destroyed. So all in all, the artillery began to hit the Joseph Smith's own began to hit this aviation battalion, who by now was out of fuel and had to be used as infantry. And they could not run any of their helicopters, not their attack helicopters and not their transport helicopters. And these two battalions of Joseph Smith's own here had moved into position here so that they could begin to shell Fort Carson itself and do counter battery fire against their artillery, which they now were doing to great effect, as you can see right here. You see they moved here, dotted line going down here. They're shelling the installation. So all in all, these forces then broke through and annihilated these forces, along with these hitting them from the flank. And the final moments of the battle were these militia battalions coming down here and attacking the perimeter, with the final unit defending being the 4th Sustainment Battalion, and what remained of the Artillery Battalion fled into the post to try and guard it. This was like the last area to fall. But eventually, as all the forces closed in, they closed in for the kill and finished them off. The results of the battle was that the capture of Fort Carson and Pueblo and the chemical weapons stockpiles at the depot at Pueblo, along with various artillery pieces, tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and Cheyenne Mountain, and most of Colorado, minus the easternmost plains and wastelands. But the victory was a great victory in terms of overall conquests and the seizure of weapons and WMDs in the form of the chemical weapons. Much like their peace treaty, their temporary truce, I should call it, with the N.S.R.F. yielded them the remaining nukes that couldn't be transported that the N.S.R.F. had transported some of by train out of the area before they sabotaged the rail networks so that they couldn't be used by the Mormon State. However, the Mormon State did manage to take several of the nukes by truck back to the Thule Army Depot to be worked on by the various specialists who regularly had worked on the robotics, such as the EOD robots and other types of robots, the various ordnances and munitions, all the electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, and software engineers who worked on the guidance systems for some of the weapons as they tested weapons, they handled weapons, they disposed of weapons. All of these Mormon specialists, who were mostly locals in Utah, Mormon locals, who had pledged their loyalty to the Mormon State, had worked on these nukes and decided that even without the regular components, they would do their best to try to rig them up so that the goal of the Council of Elders, the conversion of America to Mormonism and the placement under a theocratic state, could possibly commence with the use of a few of these nukes, perhaps. So they began to work on the nukes as these battles were underway, such as the battle you have just seen in eastern Colorado. But the next battle would occur in a different place and a different time, as the last battle was between the 4th of August and the 7th of August, roughly about the same time frame as the NSRF tried to capture the oil fields of Louisiana and the coast, and also roughly the same time as the battle I'm about to show, which was a huge campaign, a three-way battle fought between the National Salvation Revolutionary Front forces, the regime, and the Free American Army in the northeastern United States. This was the Battle of Martinsville, Virginia, or Martinsville, rather, of Virginia. It was a three-way battle, as I said, and the forces at the battle were 56,200 of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's forces, who had the largest forces accumulated for this battle that they could bring in via their limited transportation networks and fuel and other logistics. They had been stockpiling for the race to the capital. The regime had 38,000 troops at this battle to block the way to their headquarters city, their capital. The Free American Army was also trying to race on and take the capital first, as their original failed coup, explored in the second video of this 4-video series, had articulated that in great detail. They had 25,000 forces committed to this battle. So all in all, there were some 119,200 forces at this battle. And when there were casualties in this battle, more forces were steadily fed in as militias that could march, that were within marching distance, even if it was a day or two away, marching distance, were marching to be steadily fed into combat, so that this number of 119,200 stayed relatively the exact same throughout the course of the battle here. So the objective of the battle, again, was that the regime was trying to stop both the National Salvation Revolutionary Front and the Free American Army from taking their headquarters in the Cap. And, of course, the NSRF and Free American Army were fighting to get to the Cap. Each one wanted to race there first. So naturally, it brought all three of them into conflict with one another. And I take you now to the battlefield itself. This is the Battle of Martinsville, a smaller city or large town right here in southeastern Virginia. Not very far from neither West Virginia nor from Tennessee or the Carolinas. And right here was the NSRF's forces, consisting of the 5th Jolly Roger Brigades, 5th Jolly Roger Division. Because remember, a division's bigger than a brigade. They just call their Jolly Roger forces brigades, even though they're largely divisions. There's 12 of their divisions with one independent brigade that's off by itself. It's not part of an actual division. So they have 200,000 of these guys, and steadily keeping that number at 200,000 as they sacrifice them into battle. These are their most brutally fanatical forces of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. They had 2 brigades belonging to this division right here and right here. Or I'm sorry, not here. I'm sorry. Their forces were here and here, belonging to this division in the parentheses. This is their headquarters battalion. Now in the south were their core forces. The 138th Field Artillery Brigade that belonged to Kentucky, augmented with some core forces infantry here that were basically just combat vets into infantry battalions from the prior 2 wars, and a brigade support battalion, and its HIMARS battalion that belonged to this, and its Indiana Guard element that belonged to this, because Indiana's just right across from Kentucky, and they controlled parts of Indiana. So this is actually part of the Indiana Guard, but it's part of the Kentucky's 138th Brigade, so they just kept it with its original brigade, whereas there's other units of the Guard that had to break up that were part of parent units because of where they were in the country. But the N.S.R.F. was able to keep this entire element together and augment it by combining 2 battalions of core infantry forces of former combat veterans of the prior wars. And then there is the 238th Field Artillery Regiment of Kentucky, which was the M198s of a field artillery battalion, and its infantry battalion, its support battalion that was used like infantry here, and its and also its support role. It's like a security and support battalion. So it could fight, but it's also like a battle hardened type of a force, like it's hardened against like combat forces because they have heavier weapons than a regular support element does. And then you have the core infantry. And when this battle began, you also had the rival factions of the Free American Army forces and the regime up here. Now, the composition of the Free American Army forces was as so. The 30th Armored Brigade Combat Team, which was a North Carolina Guard unit, and the 3rd Battalion the 319th Airborne Artillery Regiment, which fired both the M119 and M777s, which were heavier 155 millimeters They fired both types of howitzers, 105 and 155. So you had this 3rd Battalion of the 319th Airborne. It was an airborne artillery regiment. You had the 30th Armored Brigade Combat Team, and then you had constitutional militias. As for the regime, they were very, very, very desperate at this point to stop all the other factions from reaching their capital, which is their headquarters, of course. They had the 53rd Infantry Brigade, of the 29th ID, of the 29th Infantry Division. They had the 320th Field Artillery Regiment, which all fired M119 howitzers, which are 105 millimeters. And they had lots of woke militias and foreign volunteers, such as these foreign volunteer battalions, and you got some BLMs, Antifas, and then you got more over here and down here. You got a Greenpeace thrown in there too. They armed some of those guys up and sent them to battle due to their manpower shortages. So initially, when the battle begins, you have a lot of back and forth artillery going on. You have the Free American Army's artillery battalions all shelling regime forces, and back and forth artillery between this 3rd Battalion shelling these NSRF regular militia battalions here, and the NSRF forces shelling both the Free American Army heavily, shelling their constitutional militias and on their front lines, while their regular militias slug it out here. There's a heavy battle between the regular militia forces and the constitutional militia right here. But also, you have the same going on right here as well. Now, there's not a whole lot of maneuvering going on except in the more northern parts. So what occurred here was you have these Jolly Roger Death Brigade forces here, broken in their 2 different brigades. This brigade here assaults all these National Security Forces battalion. It breaks up through the middle of them, surrounds them all, and utterly annihilates them, crushes them. And these 3 militias held in reserve came in to set up position here in case they were needed, but they weren't needed. So then, upon crushing these forces here, the Jolly Roger Death Brigades, their forces, this one brigade of their Jolly Roger 5th Division here, sets up a battle line right here against these National Security Forces battalions here. And by this point, the artillery now begins to shell them heavily to try and keep them from breaking through, to help their guys holding the front here, because they're in danger, deep danger of being broken through. While this Jolly Roger Death Brigade's brigade here, of the 5th Division of Jolly Roger, it has swung through the town after defeating this group of 3 battalions of the National Security Forces who had attacked them right here, but not realizing that these three battalions of the regime did not realize, oh yeah, there's BLM and 2 NSF ones. They did not realize that they were attacking a brigade, a full-strength brigade, as these were only 3 battalions, less than half of a brigade in size. Well, when they attacked, they met the Jolly Roger Death Brigades, who destroyed them, even though they had artillery support by this point in the battle from this battalion of the artillery right here. They had support from their artillery, but their support wasn't enough, as the Jolly Roger Death Brigades annihilated them and established a battle line here. Fearing that the lines were about to be broken through, this National Security Forces battalion here raced. It raced down here as fast as it could to plug up the gaps in the line. And these artillery forces here were now forced to become infantry and try to fend them off to the best they could. And these National Security Forces here were in big danger too, as 4 regular militia forces here raced up north just to the south of Martinsville and engaged them on their portion of the lines. The N.S.R.F was shelling heavily by this point, as their artillery battalions raced here and began to open fire on the woke militias and national security forces here, as well as other elements such as their HIMARS rocket launchers right here. This battalion of HIMARS was beginning to saturate the battlefield, saturating this entire area of regime forces. Their 53rd Infantry Brigade here of their 29th ID was being hit especially heavily. Their cavalry unit, infantry, and their combat engineers were being saturated by rocket artillery, as was the artillery batteries here that were already trying to tediously hold the line against a breakthrough by the Jolly Roger Death Brigades, who were really beginning to really put a hurting on the regime forces. Also, this Jolly Roger Death Brigade that was up here that I told you about earlier, by this point, was about to break through. They were about to destroy these guys here as the rocket artillery began to hit them, as well as the howitzer artillery from the Indiana battalion of M777 155 millimeters that belonged to the Kentucky's Guards 138th Field Artillery Brigade. They had moved into position here and were now beginning to help with the HIMARS rockets now landing here and here and here. They were beginning to shell these forces here. So woke militias and foreign volunteers right here, 8 whole battalions were rushed into battle to plug the lines of the forces now beginning to fall in battle right here. Would it be enough? Well, evidently not, because this battle ends up leading into another one that I will go through later, but I'm not done yet, as these 3 battalions here of foreign volunteers, all foreign volunteers here, were rushed to plug gaps here during the entire rocket and howitzer barrage of the forces of the N.S.R.F, hitting them very hard in their center and in their north. Now, I take you to the battle between the Free American Army and the regime. This is a 3-way battle. So, the forces of the Free American Army had moved their artillery battalion into position here. The 1st Battalion of the 113th Field Artillery Regiment moved here and began to shell the southern lines of the regime's forces of the 53rd Infantry Brigade of the 29th ID, as did the 1st Battalion of the 39th Field Artillery Regiment. 1st Battalion of the 39th Field Artillery Regiment using their 155s to shell this Greenpeace woke militia here, as well as the Antifa and the artillery battalion that belonged to the 53rd Infantry Brigade as well. Their militia forces assaulted under their friendly artillery barrage coming in, as well as the 118th Infantry... 4th Battalion of the 118th Infantry rushed into position here to fight their infantry battalion of their 53rd Brigade as well, who met them on the field of battle right here. And the 1st Battalion, the 1st Infantry Battalion of the 128th Regiment here raced into battle to flank and hit this Antifa woke militia, as their artillery support had helped them annihilate these forces before they pushed deep into enemy territory on the battlefield, once wiping out their first defensive line. Now in the south, the battle pretty much stayed stagnant against the NSRF forces, as the NSRF badly outnumbered the Free American Army. Though the Free American Army forces held their own very well against the barrages of the 155 millimeter shells coming from the Field Artillery Battalion of the 238th Kentucky Regiment here that was hitting them all along their lines, they still managed to hold out and even return artillery fire, trading shells with the NSRF, with their 3rd Battalion of the 319th Airborne Artillery Regiment, returning fire on their militia forces at the front lines. Now, this battle concludes with something very nasty. In an attempt to break up the stalemate, the NSRF was reaching the point where it was now able to use its chemical weapons in battle here, as their chemical weapon shells from Bluegrass, Kentucky, the depot they had seized, the VX shells, had finally come in and were ready to be used. The National Salvation Revolutionary Front's Indiana battalion of their 138th Kentucky Guard Field Artillery Brigade, that's that Indiana battalion that's attached to them, it was given VX nerve shells in 155 shells and sent them flying into the rear areas where the forces coalesced along the lines here, right behind the lines. They lobbed shells into the rear areas, and the gas hovered and loomed around the regime's supply areas, and a little bit of it lingered to the front. Some of the Jolly Roger brigades even died from some friendly fire due to the nerve agent blowing their way too, but it wasn't a whole lot of it because most of it was concentrated in the regime's area. And they did use several of the shells on the Free American Army as well, causing them to disperse from the battlefield a bit, because they did manage to lob about 50 shells at them, whereas they lobbed about 200 shells at the regime, because that was the first delivery of chemical shells that arrived at the battle. It was some 250 shells. They fused them up with their timed fuses so that they would hopefully air burst over the battlefield, which they did, and they saturated these forces with the chemicals in the air, which attacks the nervous system and causes breathing to be stopped, causes breathing to cease, and your lungs can no longer draw in air or exhale air. They just freeze, and everybody dies. And that is how this battle concluded. It was merely a setup for another battle in the future, as NSRF forces lost a lot of forces in the battle. They lost some 42,000 forces by the time the battle was over, of their original 56,200. The regime lost 35,000 forces of their original 38,000, leaving them only 3,000 to flee and retreat in chaos and pandemonium caused by the chemical shells, the VX shells, the nerve agents. 3,000 out of their 38,000, 35,000 regime troops died. 42,000 NSRF troops died. And Free American Army troops, 20,000 died of their 25,000 at the battle. Now remember, they had troops on their way constantly being fed into the battle from other areas, but it was going to take the NSRF a long time regardless to build up for another big battle. But at the end of the battle, they took the field. The battlefield was theirs. This was an NSRF victory, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, as it cost them a humongous toll in lives and personnel and some equipment, causing them to need more time to restock logistics, vehicles, troops, and bring up reserves from rear areas, safe rear areas that were away from the battle. Reinforcements would take a drastically long time to come in. Though that battle was over, there were still more coming. And I take you to the map. When the Martinsville battle was occurring here, right here, other battles were occurring too. Another M0rm0n State battle was beginning to take place. This one for the city of Santa Fe right here, as Supreme Acolyte Josiah had put a holy war on the Raza Narc0 State for multiple reasons. For one reason, because Mormonism is against toxins and drugs and chemicals, but also because they were also viewing them as immoral creatures, They viewed them as immoral creatures. And though they hated the N.S.R.F. equally so, they had a very shallow peace treaty with them that was to be broken at a future time. That time not yet decided, but they were furious that the arms dealers of the Raza Narc0 State would sell weapons to the N.S.R.F., who was fighting them over control of the nukes at the time. This infuriated the entire Council of Elders. All the acolytes and Grand Acolyte Mordecai and Supreme Acolyte Josiah were livid. They were livid at this point. And they put a holy war on the forces of the Raza Narc0 State, leading to the battle that would soon come at the former capital of the state, called Santa Fe. I will take you there shortly. When the Battle of Santa Fe occurred, forces were gathering. This battle occurred between the 3rd of August and the 12th of August. The battle for the capture of the last regime pocket up north, just south of Denver, was about to conclude when this battle was just beginning. As there were different forces at this battle as it was way further to the south. The total forces numbered some 35,000 belonging to the Mormon State, and some 20,000 belonging to the Raza Narc0 State. The Mormon State, in their holy war, their crusade, their holy war against the Raza Narc0 State, had priorities in this battle to destroy all of Raza's narcotics labs and kill their weapons dealers on sight, as well as seize control of the area and take whatever weapons they could from them. And in so doing, they hoped to seize control of all of New Mexico. But this would be easier said than done, as Raza, even though it had its forces largely decentralized and only controlled at local levels, as they had no one central leader, they unified in a desperate attempt to stop the much bigger, more powerful Mormon state forces who were encroaching on their territory. 35,000 forces of the Mormon State in this sector alone, and the 20,000 of Raza, would soon duke it out. Though this wasn't necessarily one of the biggest battles in the entire war, it was fairly sizable. And when the forces met on the battlefield, it was no less brutal than many other occurrences. That was for sure. So I now take you to that battle. Now, the geography of Santa Fe is very unique. I've been to Santa Fe. It's a very beautiful city. It is America's second oldest city after St. Augustine in Florida. And it has the oldest public building in the entire United States. It's a rare gem inside this country when it comes to urban style and planning, and it's a rare jewel in America's crown. As far as cities go, it is a very uniquely beautiful city. It looks exotic. It's like something you would see in Turkey or some other place with its earth tone adobe buildings that resemble some of the Middle Eastern mud huts in a way, but a lot nicer, and the European cathedrals and all of that made by the Spanish. It looks like something you could see in Turkey or some other exotic part of the world like that. But anyhow, this city, the capital of the former state of New Mexico, was being assaulted by the Mormon State. The forces of La Raza, not very big at this battle, numbered, as I said, just over, what was it, 20,000, about 20,000, against the 35,000 of the Mormon State. The Mormon State opened up the battle firing from the Rockies, from their positions on the mountains, in the mountain valleys of the Rockies in the area. Their Colorado 137th Field Artillery Regiment took the city by surprise as it fired from the foothills that nobody expected anyone to take the time to go up and set up an artillery element in, but they did. They broke down their pieces and packed them on howitzers, packed their howitzers on camels and donkeys, on carts drawn by them, and towed them up the hills and set up for the battle. This unit, as such, would remain largely stagnant during the battle, as they could not easily repack up all their pieces and move them back down. They were stuck. But they stayed to rain down shells on all the Raza Narco State forces inside the city and immediately surrounding it. The rest of the forces were these Joseph Smith's own elements of the 2nd Joseph Smith's own Brigade, which was largely an ad hoc unit with the only actual military forces in it besides the artillery battalion here, the 3rd Battalion of the 137th Field Artillery Regiment, this battalion. The only others were the 1st Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment belonging to Colorado, and the 5th Battalion of the 19th Special Operations Group, also once part of the Colorado National Guard, now part of the Mormon State. There was the 2nd Joseph Smith's own Infantry Regiment. And the 2nd Joseph Smith's own headquarters, this was all combat veterans. The 2nd Joseph Smith's own headquarters, these were like the logistics and supply and command of it, the commanders. And this was the 2nd Joseph Smith's own Horse Cav Regiment, also put together by horse riders and taken from donations from the Utah ranches where they raised horses or camels. No camels in this one, just horses. They immediately crossed the Rio Grande River here at the shallow crossing points where they could. The 1st Battalion of the 157th crossed here. They entered the city under artillery fire support from their 3rd Battalion of the 137th, formerly of the Colorado Guard, and they each crossed these 2 shallow points of the Rio Grande here to attack inside the northern parts of the city. The Horse Cavalry Regiment joined up with these 2 militia battalions, which numbered some 5,000 troops, as this regiment had 3,000 troops, and these battalions each had about 1,000, so that was 5,000 attacking troops that raced around the city, met up, and attacked right here, hitting and surprising this concentration of La Raza armored cars and these 2 battalions of infantry-type forces that raced, these militant battalions raced to try to block the attack and help their armored car brethren that were in souped-up trucks with armored plating and machine guns and mortar mounts. But they were defeated by the combo of the 1st Battalion of Infantry hitting them as well from this side, from the northwest, and these 2 militia battalions and the Horse Cavalry Battalion riding in and hitting them from the northeast. And they broke through and destroyed these 3 battalions here, the armored cars and the militia militant battalions, and raced down into the city. They then began to attack these militia battalions here. This one raced in to plug the gap and try to hold them off as long as they could. And the entire affair deteriorated into one of classic urban warfare. building to building, house to house. Once that these bigger forces, larger forces, got into the city proper, it deteriorated into urban warfare by this point. Now, the artillery shells continue to race down. So when this militant battalion raced in to stop these M0rm0n State forces, they were also trying to escape the artillery bombardment that was already in effect as well. Same with this battalion, rushing to the river to try to block these 5 regular militias battalions here of the M0rm0n State from crossing. The Raza rocket artillery forces, armed with NJ-230 Chinese rocket artillery vehicles, that were 130mm rockets fired from an NJ-230 truck, an old Chinese surplus type of vehicle with the rocket artillery on it, the 130mm and 12 tubes each. There was a whole battalion of them. So there were roughly a few hundred of these rocket launchers firing a massive barrage at these militia forces that were trying to cross the river to assist these 2 militant forces that were trying to block this approach here, and this one force here trying to block these bigger forces coming in from this side. So it was like a big pincer to come to the middle. Now in the south, about this time, what you had here was you had these militias here surrounding these militant forces of the Raza Narc0 State, trying to keep their supply lines open on Interstate 25. And they attacked head-on and flanked them and destroyed them as this one came in to help. And they got into battle against them, destroyed them before racing on here to head up and around to get to the other side of the river and seize the bridge, so that in seizing the bridge, other forces could cross the bridge and capture the area. Now, neither side had any air power committed to this battle, of course, as the M0rm0n State had to use theirs sparingly, and the Raza Narc0 State really didn't have any outside of a few civilian helicopters that they rigged up with machine guns and such. No air power was used, so there was really no battlefield observation, but they did have maps, and they used their maps of the key features to decide what was strategically viable and necessary to capture and what was not. So the bridges were, of course, important. Street bridges going into the city and this big highway bridge that would be a logistical train for the M0rm0n State to go further to the east. Now, as that was going on, you had these 3 militia battalions here and these 4 here coming down because they were going to encircle the city along with these forces crossing here on the bridge. And these militant forces here, these two militant battalions of Raza forces, Los Zetas, MS-13, and other types of gangsters with heavier weapons than normal, they raced up here to try to block the assault of these powerful M0rm0n State militias that were attacking south. Now these 3 here were coming down, with this one being held in reserve in case it was needed. And these 2 tried to attack it. They did not want their highway, which was their logistical route going to the to other forces of theirs in the east. They did not want that being cut off, or else the forces in the city would utterly fail. But it would be too late for that anyway, because at the bridge, this one single militant element here was defeated by these militants of the M0rm0n State attacking here. These militant militias were going head-to-head, these 2. And this one broke off contact upon this one flanking around from the south and hitting them from the sides, from the south side. They broke contact and did a fighting retreat, where these other remaining ones did a fighting retreat as well to establish a new defensive line, as they had to protect their drug labs and their money-making avenues that were located a bit further to the south in Albuquerque. Because remember, the Raza Narco State made much of their income for their war chest and for their general existence off of narcotics and off of weapons deals. So they had to protect their vital assets that were further south, as they were becoming very, very outnumbered by the Mormon state forces gathering in the area, and they were a big threat. They also needed to call more reinforcements from other parts of the Raza Narco State, as well as parts of Latin America, as they sent radio programs out and other such from ham radio operators to their elements in Mexico that they needed more help. And that was the one time they really relied on ham radio, was to get their help message out upon the fall of the city of Sante Fe, because Sante Fe did eventually fall, as you can see. By the time these forces crossed the bridge and these came up, they finished the encirclement of the city, regardless of what was going on right here. And they encircled the remaining forces in the city and captured it, with the Raza Narco State gradually developing a new defensive line to the southeast of the city itself. Now, this battle was between the 3rd of August and the 12th of August, and the casualties of this battle were some 12,000 Mormon State casualties, and among Raza Narco State, it was some 13,000 of their 20,000, and 12,000 of the Mormon State of their 35,000. The Mormon State had heavily outnumbered the Raza Narco State at the battle, though the Raza Narco State had some, by some metric, some better artillery forces due to their large mobile Chi-Com-made rocket launching systems that they had a large concentrated amount of. They were still heavily outnumbered on the battlefield. And though the Mormon State had their forces, their artillery in the mountains and could not easily move them, they did the desired effect, and they helped to defeat all of the Raza Narco State's forces that were inside of the city itself. They captured the old city of Sante Fe with only 12,000 casualties among the Mormon State of their 35,000, and again, 13,000 of the Raza. The Raza losing just a little bit more than the Mormon State, with 4,000 Raza forces escaping and 3,000 being captured that were inside of Sante Fe. Of the 3,000 that were captured, 500 agreed to convert to Mormonism, to Josiah's brand of Mormonism, and the other 2,500 were beheaded. And that is the end of that battle. Now, I take you back to another area of the conflict, a familiar area. After the conclusion of the victory of seizing Sante Fe, the forces embroiled in the four-way battle here over the Hoover Dam were preparing for the second battle of the Hoover Dam, as Las Vegas itself had largely deteriorated into a stalemate of factions that were just brutally engaged in non-stop firefights across the city, with intermittent artillery in the form of rocket and howitzer raining down on the city, with occasional airstrikes from the air base at Nellis due to its close proximity and not costing a lot of fuel to fly one or two aircraft at a time out of there when they were available. So as that deteriorated, another battle ensued. It was the second battle for the Hoover Dam, as again, all factions in the area embroiled in the battle wanted it for themselves because of the immense electricity that it generated. For the regime, it was sending much of it back to the loyalist areas of California, while for the other factions, the American Army wanted it for itself to power its areas and then take the rest of Vegas and power Vegas with it. The Mormon State wanted it because its electricity coverage was very, very patchy in its territory, as it relied on coal-burning plants primarily and had to use horse-drawn or mule or even cattle-drawn wagons of coal from coal mines located in northern Utah to get to their power plants, causing them to have to do power rotation on a rotational basis. Also, damage from the fighting contributed to certain areas of the country just being all the way out of electricity, as this was unable to be addressed unless it was by dedicated personnel that had a desire to restore electricity to certain places and were able to rig it up. Things, as far as rigging, that would have never been allowed in the prior society due to safety concerns, that were now allowed in the new society, in the new paradigm, out of necessity, because there was no other way to restore power other than rigging up damaged and destroyed infrastructure in ways that it could conceivably work. As I told you all in previous parts of the series, technicians and engineers and specialists would play a role in this conflict that no one had ever before imagined. And including in infrastructure, that was one of the such ways that it mattered, that those types of people mattered. But they also mattered in destructive ways too. It wasn't all just relegated to positive ways. They did very, very destructive things, which I will go into later into this video. But I take you to the second battle of the Hoover Dam. Now, when this battle began, of the forces involved, there were some 9,000 regime forces remaining after the first battle. Now remember, they had been under heavy siege for quite a long time. At the dam and in the city, in their positions in the city, in Boulder City and Henderson, surrounding areas, they were under heavy assault by this point in the battle. Now, the M0rm0n State had 1,000 troops at this battle of their 8,000 strong Brigham Young Brigade, which was basically one battalion involved in the actual combat right here in this battle. And the Union of Southwest Militias had 7,000 troops at this particular part of the battle, this second battle of the Hoover Dam. And the Free American Army, 13,000 troops. So by this point, at the second battle for the Hoover Dam, the Free American Army had the most forces committed at this battle, followed by the regime at 9,000, followed by the Union of Southwest Militias, then followed by the M0rm0n State, only sending one battalion into this particular battle, as they had another remains of whatever remained of the battalion that they sent into Vegas itself, plus a third battalion that was still sitting on the northern edge of Lake Mead that was not yet committed to any battles, just to occupy that territory. Now, at this battle here, this does not include the forces that were fighting inside of the city of Vegas itself. The objective, again, was to control the Hoover Dam. So this is a more cut and dry objective. And all the forces were fighting to control it. So now I take you to the battle. This is the second battle of the Hoover Dam. This being the Hoover Dam. This is a more zoomed in on type of a version of the last map. There was the battle, it was the first battle of the Hoover Dam that had also included the Battle of Vegas. This is just the second battle of just the Hoover Dam, as Vegas is basically deteriorated into just a stalemate of street-by-street combat. Seemingly unending. Now, the Brigham Young Brigade is across Lake Mead here on the northern end, so that's why I have their unit emblem in parentheses, because they're on the other end of the lake. You cannot see them except for their one battalion that tried to It was their 2nd battalion, as their 1st battalion was already in the city, and what remained of it was still in there fighting. The 3rd battalion is still across Lake Mead. It was in the area to begin with. Then you have the the Union of the Southwest Militias. Their army is here, 7,000 forces north of the road. As I told you in the last video, they basically conquered all the areas just to the north of the road leading into the dam. So you had that. Then you had the regime holding their very, very tenuous positions here along the dam. And on the east side, you still have their same units from before, but they're still being heavily pummeled by rocket artillery by this point of the battle. These forces here had more deliveries of logistics, including rockets, including ammunition and food and everything, fuel, whatever they needed to continue pressing against these forces. They had by this point regrouped. And two new constitutional militia battalions joined the battle and had come up from their from other communities that they had already occupied in that sliver of land I showed you on the bigger map, on the larger map. They had been moving up to assist these 5 already here and their HIMARS battalion that was already there. Now remember, these are the same units as were on the big map of the Vegas and 1st battle map of the Hoover Dam. And basically, it's pretty straightforward. What happens in this battle is these M0rm0n State forces had originally come and hooked around, and they were going to meander and sneak and get up close and assault the regime from the north. But they were caught by these forces of the Union of Southwest Militias, who already was basically sick and tired of having to deal with the M0rm0n State, as they were also one of the M0rm0n State's enemies, and they already had several of their battalions already destroyed by the M0rm0n State's 1st Battalion, not just on the way to the city, where one was ambushed and destroyed, but inside the city itself. So Todd Ellison's force is here, Todd Ellison being the leader of the entire Union of Southwest Militias and the associated forces and leaders. Todd Ellison was sick of the M0rm0n State, and he basically relayed orders that any M0rm0n State units should be dealt with immediately, as they could be much more of a threat than any of the other enemies on the map could be. So these 2 battalions here blocked them along the lake, so they were surrounded on 2 sides with the shore to their back. And the M0rm0n State did fight them for a long time, but as they began to get low on ammo, they decided to do a breakout. So they broke out and headed back to their starting positions, with very, very few survivors compared to at the beginning of the battle, as they had to fight. They were outnumbered by a factor of 2 to 1, but they also employed suicide vehicles and a lot of other things. These 2 battalions took heavy casualties too. It wasn't just the M0rm0n State. There was a heavy battle the whole way around right here. Then you had these 5 right here attacking different positions along the road here as they occupied the northern part of the road. They attacked the regime by the dam, by the entrance to the dam on the western side of the Colorado River. So these 2 attacked here. This one and these 2 attacked here along this area. And these 2 here attacked due south. And then for the Free American Army, you had these constitutional militias and these air assault units and former attack helo forces that were basically their helos were all shot up from the last battle. They now served as infantry. So they combined and amalgamated together and conducted a massive assault to the north. So the regime's forces were being hit from the north by the the Union of Southwest Militias, and from the south by the Free American Army forces, as well as from the eastern sliver of the Free American Army forces too. So the regime was also being rocketed badly by this point, and their supplies that they had inside the dam were beginning to get very, very, very low. Forces from the Boulder area tried to break through and clear a spot on the road, but were ambushed the entire way by constitutional militia forces and this 1st Battalion, which is now infantry, as it says, now infantry, right there. They assaulted and ambushed these woke militias, these 2 woke militias that tried to break through and clear a route to open a way for the regime to potentially flee if they needed to retreat, because they knew they were getting low on supplies. They were getting emergency transmissions from the regime elements, and the forces were about to effect a breakthrough when the Union of Southwest Militias broke in and cut them off, and the Free American Army also basically initially had them surrounded here too. So all in all, the woke militias were destroyed, and the dam was mostly captured by the Free American Army forces, who by this point, after heavy rocketing, had broken through these 3 battalions here, this National Security Forces and 2 infantry battalions belonging to the 79th California Infantry Brigade Combat Team of the Guard, of the California Guard. They were all annihilated, and they broke through and seized the dam, and the regime forces down here, what was now remaining of their artillery battalion after the first battle, which was now infantry, and their cavalry battalion, which is now infantry, that belonged to the 79th here, the Infantry Brigade Combat Team of the California Guard, they were all now infantry forces, more or less. They all lost all their heavy equipment due to rocketing and the original attack helicopters coming in and blasting the artillery howitzers to bits with rocket pods and Hellfires and such. They also lost a lot of their Bradleys and some of their tanks too. So they were all now infantry forces, whoever remained. These forces were very drastically worn down to the nub by all the fighting from the last battle and now this battle. So now the dam was under control of the Free American Army for now. But Todd Ellison's forces defeated these regime forces here and pushed down, and were now fighting the Free American Army forces here. So all in all, what happened was you had the results being that the casualties were, the regime suffered 6,500 casualties of its 9,000, with 2,500 becoming prisoners of war, which were the remaining 2,500 that didn't die. You have the M0rm0n State suffering 700 casualties of its 1,000-man battalion it sent down to the lake, so leaving 300 to break out and retreat, with 0 prisoners of war, because they don't ever surrender. They're not allowed to, by their faith. The Union of Southwest Militias suffered 3,250 casualties of its force of 7,000 in the area, with 145 taken prisoner of war by the Free American Army. The Free American Army lost 4,000 casualties of its 13,000, with 500 taken prisoner. The Free American Army seizes control of the Hoover Dam. Free American Army seizes control of the Hoover Dam, and south of the highway on the west side of the dam, the Union of Southwest Militia seizes control of the north side of the road on the west side of the dam. Last regime forces an area in Vegas, now trapped in downtown, having lost McCarran, the airport, and Nellis, with no hope for resupply. Guerrilla attacks from M0rm0n State Brigham Young Brigades, 2nd Battalion near the dam, And inside Northeast Vegas, the 1st Battalion withered down all sides to the nub. However, regime forces hold a tiny, tiny remaining pocket in eastern Vegas only. Northwest Vegas is under Free American Army control, with North, Central, South Vegas, and Boulder City under the Union of Southwest Militias control. So they captured all that stuff after the first Battle of Vegas and after the second battle concluded of the Hoover Dam. I'm just telling you all the areas in Vegas that were taken since the end of this battle. Now, after the capture of the dam by the Free American Army, the M0rm0n State Brigham Young Brigade began to reinforce on the north side of Lake Mead to continue to conduct guerrilla warfare and terrorist-style attacks on its enemies inside of Vegas. 1 month later, regime forces facing famine and nearly out of ammo surrendered to the Free American Army, as opposed to the 2 other factions, because they knew what would happen if they were taken by the M0rm0n State, and they also didn't want to surrender to the Union of Southwest Militias, because they looked at the Free American Army as the most humane out of all 3 factions. Even though the Union of Southwest Militias wasn't even that bad, they didn't want to surrender to them because they viewed the Free American Army as being more of a by-the-book faction, if you will. So they surrendered to them. Now, this war became a really, really nasty conflict for everybody. Basically, there were all manner of atrocities committed, many, many millions of civilian deaths due to a variety of causes, scenes of battle and WMDs, uses, and the scenes of the after effects of nerve gas horrified many, not just in the land, but around the world too, such as in former European allies, countries, and NATO, and so on and so forth, who got exclusive footage of the conflict by viewing a lot of M0rm0n State accounts and other accounts on the net in foreign nations set up for each faction, where loyalists and agents of some of the factions that lived outside the nation as expatriates were able to create these accounts, as the net inside of the United States was shut down. So materials and videos had to be smuggled out of the nation to be put on these accounts for foreign audiences, such as the M0rm0n states called by the faith forces, now coming in droves to support the Council of Elders and Supreme Acolyte Josiah. And I will show you some of the battle scenes themselves as I explain more about some of the goings-on as far as the WMDs are concerned. See, here you have a W-88 nuclear warhead inside of a standard camper van. It has a 475 kiloton yield. And the M0rm0n State had loaded one into a camper van. Its technical experts, engineers, and civilian contract workers and such, and ordnance handling specialists, all the M0rm0n State experts came together to figure out how to rig up one of these bad boys for use in the cause of the M0rm0n State, to convert all non-believers to Supreme Acolyte Josiah's version of Mormonism. As you can see in the picture here, you have the warhead, and it's propped up on some very sturdy, strong mounts drilled into the floor to hold it in place. You have a box with wires in the background as the control box for the detonation. And you would have a crew of some devoted members driving the vehicle and its payload to whatever target was to be nuked by this type of weapon of mass destruction here. And then, of course, you had the infamous nerve agents being sarin or VX shells. This is basically what VX shells look like, you guys. You know, I was in field artillery. We had manuals that had these in it. And, you know, you can go look at pictures of these things. This is one without the fuse. This is with the nose plug taken off. The nose plug is when you deliver shells, they have a nose plug on them to protect the part where the fuse goes into, just if you wanted to know. And here's one with the fuse screwed on, tightened on there with the fuse setter wrenches. You can see it's fused and ready to go. It's got a time fuse on it so it can do an air burst. And you have a 198, an M198 howitzer here. And that's basically what the howitzer looks like from the back, like you're about to load the shells. There you got one of the crew members here. This could be any faction. This could be the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. It could be the M0rm0n State, or it could be Regime, because those three factions had chemical weapons. So it could be any one of those three in this picture. Get you a bigger picture of it here. Takes a lot to draw these, so. But that's the VX. While all of this was going on, of course, you had the leadership of the different factions deciding on what their next move should be, and you had them developing their own economic systems to do various things, such as feed their people, which was all organized mostly on a local basis, as there was a food crisis in the land. Some entire regions of the nation starved completely. Not just due to the war, but also due in part to the fact that the supply chain was forever gone. So, you had various different issues occurring as a result of the food collapse. You had factions requisitioning food for their forces only, while the civilian populations in entire areas near the front began to die and starve to death. You had entire families becoming bloated, like you see in sub-Saharan African nations when people are about to die of starvation. Their stomachs become bloated. Well, that began to happen in the United States in various regions that were close to the actual front lines of battle. Food could not be produced in local areas near the battle because there was no supply chain to feed these people anymore, so they had to rely on subsistence farming only. Subsistence farming only worked in areas where there was no combat. So therefore, you had areas near the actual battles themselves being stripped of all food to feed the combatants for the major battles, but also on a smaller scale for smaller battles, as in like the low-intensity combat between factions. Like along the battle fronts, you may have had skirmishes or small unit combat or ambushes or landmine planting or ordnance planting and daisy chains of munitions along roads that would hit enemy convoys or targets that would march along said roads, or, you know, so on and so forth, or occasional back and forth shelling in limited amounts. That is called low intensity warfare. Occasional tiny airstrikes too. But high intensity warfare was your massive battles between factions where they gathered forces in huge quantities to go head-to-head on the battlefield, with sometimes air support, like I've shown you in the previous battles just mentioned, and sometimes not. Sometimes it was all ground forces slugging it out. But before I take you to the last 3 battle maps of the entire war, I'm going to show you more scenes of battle, and including the atrocities committed by each faction. And then I'm going to talk about what the leadership was doing as far as the war progressed, before I go on to the final maps. Again, I have to charge the phone, so this part is going to be a lot of reading and explaining. So, yes. As the oil was very limited for the conflict, food production was relegated to what could be produced by hand, or picked by hand, or planted by hand. As people no longer had jobs in most parts of the country due to the breaking up of the land into different areas of factional control and combat and conflict, what began to occur was you had everybody becoming subsistence farmers that didn't live in big cities. Every person in a rural area that was able-bodied, mostly women, as most of the men were tasked to joining up the factions as their fighting forces, unless it was the neutral areas where people just banded together to protect their communities in huge swathes of the country, such as what I've shown on the map and explained earlier in this video and others. But in the factional areas, men were often drafted up into militias or formed into militias willingly, or other types of forces, and joined their factions that their territory was beneath, that their local areas were beneath. And the women often became subsistence farmers in many areas. Now, this was the case everywhere, but in the Mormon state, they tended to treat women the worst, but I will go into all of that a bit later. But the farming, the economy was mostly based upon farming, and it was also mostly based on trade. You had a lot of local trade. You had a lot of different things going on at the local level, as there was no more macro economy left. Many areas created new currencies or relied on ancient forms of currency, such as barter, gold, silver. Precious jewelry was even used as a currency in some places. Whatever was perceived to have any value was used as a currency in most of the factional areas. In the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, for instance, there was a big gold and silver drive, or rather a precious metal drive, which was there to get all the supporters of the N.S.R.F. faction within its territory to voluntarily contribute all their old jewelry, all their old gold and silver and platinum and other such precious metals, to put them all into local donation pots to be used to purchase weapons for their Jolly Roger Death Brigades, which was their paramilitary forces. When it was discovered that weapons dealers from the Raza Narc0 State had made inroads to the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, asking them if they needed any weapons, in addition to the tons of American weapons that they already had possessed anyway, and their millions upon millions of small arms owned by their various militias. They had come in and asked if they needed any additional weapons, foreign weapons. And of course, Russia and China, as I said before, their intelligence agencies were looking for ways to further destabilize the United States. So, through third countries such as Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, and in Mexico, they sent crates and pallets of weapons, surplus weapons, easy to mass produce, and also in the millions in China and Russia that were no big deal to hawk off to be sold or given. They sold the weapons from third countries, the MSS of China, the intelligence agency of China, and the FSB of Russia, their intelligence agency, arranged for the sale of surplus stocks of their weapons to be given to Venezuela to be sold to the Raza Narc0 State, who then turned around and sold about half of their weapons. Well, not half, maybe about a third, I should say, rather. A third of their weapons to the N.S.R.F, who then in turn turned around and used those weapons to equip their new elite paramilitary death squads. And some of their youth killers brigades, which they had roughly 3 of, a division and an independent brigade. The youth killers were drafted as a way to supplement the manpower in different areas. As the child soldiers, a common facet in African civil wars and other African wars, made their way into the American culture as Albert Motufu, one of the Troika leaders here, had demanded that child soldiers be brought into the fold because they would make the best killers, because that was done in his parents' Congo, because his parents were from Congo. He was born in America, but he was interested in the land of his ancestry, so he looked into recent history, discovered Mobutu Sese, the Congolese ultranationalist dictator, as well as the combat that occurred there and its long-running civil wars, and decided that he too wanted to use child soldiers because they make the best killers, and he also wanted to that's considered an atrocity in modern warfare, you guys, to use child soldiers, so I'm just letting you know that off the script. But anyways, he wanted to use child soldiers and conduct limb hacking because he felt that limb hacking, chopping off legs and arms, would send a terrifying message to enemies that they would be dealt with in the most severe ways imaginable. There would be no tolerance for enemies in the NSRF, and their death squads would meticulously hunt down and butcher enemies such as former regime members or supporters, wokesters, globalists, anybody who espoused globalist ideologies, anybody who was a snitch under the previous regime. All of those were considered enemies of the ultra-nationalist, secular humanist, National Salvation Revolutionary Front faction, the biggest faction in the entire conflict in terms of population size, surpassing the regime within the first month, and had the biggest forces, and had the biggest territory by far. It had a lot of territory to cover, which is mostly what it had to use its humongous forces to do, comprised of its massive militias and its decent-sized core forces. Its 3.8 million man regular militias comprised the vast majority of its forces. Its ultranationalist militias of 3.8 million regular militias. Then there were and included in that were the child soldiers, of course. Then they had their 200,000 man paramilitary death brigades, which constantly had to be replenished by pooling men from other units, such as mostly from their large militia forces, but also pulling them from the core forces, which were the actual military forces, who were willing to actually let them have a few of their forces. Normally that didn't happen because the de facto military leader of the entire Troika, who was Colonel McGregor, was not having much of that. He only allowed it in emergency situations when certain forces along the lines where a big breakthrough was needed had to be given up and sent to the paramilitary forces who belonged to Alfred Motufu because of the manpower requirements. But typically, Colonel McGregor, who ran the military, the regular military forces, the militias and the core forces, he typically didn't give up his forces to the paramilitary ranks that easily. He typically kept them for himself. Rarely did he give up his core forces elements, but he most readily was willing to give up his militias, as they were common and not as well trained or battle hardened as the core forces were, and well trained either. So naturally, that was the case. The third member of the Troika, the math professor formerly of the University of Iowa, known as Professor Albertson, he was the head of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's prison system, including its extermination centers. There were 3 classifications. They were former state and federal level penal facilities that were taken over by the N.S.R.F. and converted into these different other facilities, I'll just say. One was for enemy prisoners of war, where they could expect to be starved and poorly treated from the different factions, beaten, tortured, murdered indiscriminately, executed. But then there was the actual death centers, the extermination centers, which were facilities that were made specifically for the horrendous mass murder of the enemies of the N.S.R.F. Eventually, the hangings and the mass shootings and other forms of butchery, limb hacking, and everything else were moved into these facilities and placed under command of the third member of the Troika here, the math professor, Professor Albertson, who also was the economic leader, the de facto economic and logistical leader of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's forces, as him being a math professor made him the best candidate for such, obviously. And in so doing, he often refused a lot of prisoners food because he felt that even if it was a quarter of a percentage point of food, he felt that it could be better used in the combat by the combat forces of the NSRF instead of giving it to prisoners who would just be a waste if we were going to exterminate them anyway. You can see how he views human beings as statistics. That's a key trademark of secular humanism, you guys. They don't care about people. They look at people like they're numbers. That's all. That's why he made a good prison leader. Some atrocities of the NSRF included mass hangings. Like I said, they were later on down the line moved inside of the prisons and pulled out of public view. As for a while, for about several weeks, they had already by that point hung and eliminated by firing squad and other methods many of their opponents. Not that these things still didn't continue ever in public, but they were less prevalent there, as they tended to prefer to send their elements, their enemies' elements, on death marches to facilities where they were supposed to be exterminated. Instead of making them have a quick end, they wanted to start to make it more miserable by including death marches into the itinerary of execution to the extermination centers. Now, as for the Mormon State, the other major, most radical faction on the map, they found the guillotines ordered by the regime and began to use them for their own purposes, their own desires, and their own ideology. And Josiah, Supreme Acolyte Josiah's warped and crazy version of Mormonism was to be accepted by all, or else you would be decapitated as such. You could see this has seen a lot of use with all the blood crusted around it. These are the religious police of the Mormon state, whose job was to go around and check on matters of the heart, as the edicts called it. And they would test people within Mormon state territory to see where their heart lay before deciding what their final disposition would be. Could they, as the scales depict, and the sword for beheading and fighting, but if in matters of the heart, as Josiah called it, if they were worthy of being converted, they could be converted and would have to go to special classes to learn about the ideology of Supreme Acolyte Josiah and his council of elders. That was if they were not found wanting by the religious police, who had criteria that they had to go by. These atrocities were very common methods of execution, but also so was throwing their victims off of cliffs and mountainsides and tall buildings also. That was when beheading wasn't a viable option for certain ones, for whatever the reason. Now, the scenes of combat were intense throughout the entire conflict. There were many instances where there were massive artillery barrages, use of tanks, infantry, but there was also a lot of static warfare as well, as fuel was very limited and logistics were very limited. You perhaps couldn't always send your forces places, or if you could, you had to send them in very small amounts, such as in the battles that I've basically created the maps for. You have very small elements overall you have very small elements, with the biggest battles usually including less than 300,000 total forces, much less than that typically. Most of the battles include under 100,000, which is, you know, they're like moderately sized battles, but they're not like these humongous, ginormous campaigns like in my foreign invasion scenarios that I've created. They're not like that at all. These entirely hinge on the fact that by this point, America's logistics are basically in the shitter. There's not a lot they can do. There's not a lot they can do at all at this point. But here in the bottom is an example of Mormon state forces and their armor-plated technicals. Now, they've begun to soup up their pickup trucks with armor plating, and you can see this this bishop here, who's like basically a captain in their forces. You can see this bishop is firing his recently captured W85 heavy Chi-Com machine gun, as is the man in the technical in front of him. They used a combo of 50 cals, which they already had access to from their units that defected and other forces and depots, but they also acquired some of the captured foreign weapons that were taken from the Raza Narc0 State, such as the machine gun in this picture, the heavy machine gun. They're shooting off across the desert at a distance, while a mortar team deployed out of one of the other vehicles, set up their mortar tube, and began to fire. You can see the guy on the foreground here. He's trying to pick up one of the mortars and going to go run it over to the man dropping it in the tube and launching them, trying to provide fire support to these machine gun technicals here that are armor plated, as you can see. Then in the top part, you have one of the HIMARS systems, the multiple launch rocket systems here. It's a HIMARS for high mobility. So you have it firing one of its rockets, and this one belongs to the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, who used these systems to great effect. Many factions had these systems, but, you know, the N.S.R.F. was well known for theirs and how they used theirs. They saturated many areas with these, all concentrated together. Then up here, of course, you have the urban battle scenes and that are typical of inside of cities and larger towns. You have a knocked out Abrams tank. Then you have another Abrams tank pulling up with its infantry support, which could be regular militia. They could be former defecting army units, or they could be whatever. They could be paramilitary. It could be any combo of things, because in an internal conflict, there's all kinds of different forces that'll emerge. This even could be regime forces in a battle, who knows? But, you know, most, if not all, of the factions had armor by a certain point. There's artillery out in the desert, one of those 155 millimeter howitzers, an M198, like the one that fired the WMDs I showed you, the back view from. The VX or sarin shells. Sarin is a different nerve agent than VX, but they could fire sarin shells just like they could fire the VX shells I showed you. VX is even more deadly than sarin. And this country produced a lot of that back in the day. It still has a lot of it in the depots. Just more battle scenes and atrocity scenes. Some of the limb hacking and mass graves, and what they did to some of their worst enemies that they hated the most. They tied them to stakes and burned them alive with oil and more. Here's a typical garden shed that they're using to keep their supplies in. This is like a little base camp for the death squads, the Jolly Roger death squads of the Jolly Roger death brigades. This is a M0rm0n State suicide truck. They started armor plating their 18-wheelers over time and their containers, knowing that they were full of different munitions acquired from the Thule Army Depot. They began to pack them full of munitions before sending them into their martyr missions, as they called them. You have an acolyte firing his, not a bishop, but an acolyte firing his heavy machine gun at these Army or Union of Southwest Militias technicals on the other ridge across the desert. Maybe about 500 to 800 meters away, where they can still see them. Other forces are shooting, firing mortars. About ready to close up the back and get ready for their mission there. Okay. So essentially, you have a pretty good concept of the conflict thus far. You have a general idea of the ebb and flow of how the battles move, about what the factions are after, how they move, based on the amount of fuel they have and logistics. You understand that their economic systems are based upon largely precious metals and commodities, and not based on so much money. But the secessionist Republic of Texas, however, did have an actual currency it came out with, seeing itself as a sovereign nation, just like Florida. The two developed their own currencies. Texas's currency was backed by gold and its oil commodities, so it was naturally worth a lot more. But the Florida commodities were backed by its food and the perceived value of its service economy, which still slightly a little bit functioned. It slightly functioned. Mostly in the Miami and Florida Keys areas once the conflict had calmed down. Because after the Florida new regime seized power, they basically had defeated all regime forces except for those that were on the Daytona Beach area. They were in that narrow sliver on the map, and also the ones in the Jacksonville area that were defeated in a battle wherein they and their allies, the Army of the Southeast, had, like I've shown in the last video, had come in together to liberate Jacksonville from the regime, and they did so, leaving the regime basically defeated in Florida, because once they also did that, they also eliminated the sliver in Daytona Beach, as the forces there were considerably even smaller than what was in inside of Jacksonville itself. So the economies varied again. They all varied from place to place, but most places had old-fashioned barter and trade systems. The Mormon State system was basically a market economy in the very, very literal sense. It was like an old, ancient Middle Eastern market economy. Whatever people had, they brought to the market, including women, which were looked at as property and sold as wives in the market, because the polygamist views and beliefs held by the Mormon State were pushed very hard in their territory. Women lost rights inside the Mormon State. They had no rights. They were treated as property to be bought or sold, kept as wives, multiple wives, to be child bearers and bring up strong Mormon families, and also to do all the menial labor around their compounds and homes. So the Mormon State was very, very like quasi-Middle Eastern in how they did things, but even more repressive. They committed what was called a lot of female genital mutilations, which, read about that. A lot of that occurs in sub-Saharan Africa. Not so much there, but more in like Saharan Africa, I should say. Saharan Africa and the Middle East and Afghanistan also do a lot of female genital mutilations. It's a cultural practice there. And you can read about that if you want to, but I'm not going to talk about it. But that's one of the atrocities they commit. It's against women. So they treat women like property in the Mormon State and make multiple wives marry one man as a polygamous sort of a thing. So that's a common practice under Supreme Acolyte Josiah and his Council of Elders under their Mormon State, their beliefs that they've turned Mormonism into. They basically took Mormonism and made it even more extreme. So they took it in like a really warped, crazy direction. So anyways, they had a barter and trade economy, basically a Middle Eastern style local bazaar held in every single solitary community within the Mormon State. And they used a lot of their commodities from these market economies, these bazaars, to fund their armed forces. Their resources, everything. They had a lot of coal. They had a lot of coal resources, which they were able to use to power their coal power plants, but they had to use a lot of animal labor. They had to use a lot of oxen and cattle and just donkeys, horses, whatever they could actually enlist to help them pull the coal to the coal-burning plants. This, in effect, caused the limited remaining amount of staff at these plants to have to budget power across the land. And they did so, and they did it on a rotating basis, sort of like what's done in Iraq or other third world nations, where they rotate electricity from village to village. You'll see one village lit up in the middle of the night, then it'll all go out. Then off in the horizon, another one will light up. Those rolling brownouts, controlled rolling brownouts, began to happen across the Mormon State and other regions, but that was common in the Mormon State. Then you had the Raza Narc0 State, another extreme faction, though not as big as the Mormon State, or even as big as the regime, Well, sometimes it was, but it depended on how many came and went from the territory, and other factors too, such as people dying in battle and other such. But what they had was they had a totally narcotics and weapons based economy. They set up a lot of drug labs inside the territory they controlled inside of New Mexico, and they also sold weapons. And they used the proceeds from their sales to be able to buy whatever they needed to try to defend their territory. So it was basically a loop. They didn't really care about what their civilians in their territory wanted. It was like a criminal wonderland. Any gang or thug, or it was lawless. Anybody that wanted to do whatever they wanted came in there and robbed, raped, pillaged, and plundered the local civilians in their territory. And machine gunning of civilian areas was common by La Raza militants, as the different gangs and groups and narco and terrorists, they didn't care who suffered. So they also conducted assassinations. They did a bunch of other heinous things. But their economy was mostly gun running and drug running and producing. So that was what they were able to do as their economy. You had the Texas and Florida economies, like I said, that established their own currencies. Then, let's see. You had the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. Their entire economy, their financial system was precious metals based. Like flat out just gold and silver and platinum jewelry was money. Or palladium even too. They didn't care as long as you had some sort of precious metals. You had money. But they also did manage to allow some trade and barter. Those were for the poorer people that didn't have any precious metals. They allowed them to trade and barter, but in limited quantities. They let neighbors trade with neighbors. They didn't have these humongous market areas. They didn't allow that. Not commonly. So there were black markets, but which were underground. But they were very, very controlling. I'll just put it. Let's see. The regime, they still use their collapsed U.S. dollars. They went to go implement their digital dollar, but they had a lot of issues with it because there were frequent power outages in regime territory, so people couldn't use their money. It was basically worthless by that point anyway. They weren't just going to come out with some new currency and it automatically have some sort of a real value to it. So all in all, whether it was their paper money or their new digital money, it was all equally worthless, as it was basically in the middle of a conflict. They had no viable resources or economies, so they were basically using collapsed money. And discipline in their forces broke down often due to the fact that they weren't getting paid anything of real value. Discipline often broke down because literally they were only subsisting off of food and water. So while fighting for the regime, they were only getting fed, and that was their only payment. They were basically slaves. So they were fighting to get fed and drink and have water to drink, but that was it. That was it. Because then the regime hardly was able to upkeep that, which caused some units to mutiny, causing the regime to respond by using sarin shells on them or other civilian areas where civilians mutinied over the economic conditions. So the regime was basically on its last legs by this point. It was utterly collapsed, and it was staying collapsed, and nothing was getting better. All the promises and propaganda they made the people in their loyalist areas wasn't working. I mean, yes, they continued to threaten people to do what they did, but even that was starting to take a toll in a way that they were really unable to effectively continue the war in any sort of even really viable means. Like, not even viable, I mean, obviously not viable in the offensive sense of taking things back that they lost, but they were barely even able to stay viable in defensive warfare. They were getting defeated and destroyed on every front by every other faction. They were barely able to hold on to power. Barely, by a thread. They barely even held on during the original coup done by the Free American Army, nor all the other coups that occurred in other local areas. like the NSRF's humongous local coup system, which was a series of local level coups that all combined to form their faction, their entire area. And it all spread like wildfire. Essentially, the other four remaining very small factions, the Maine Militia, the Army of the Southeast, the Union of Southwest Militias, and the Northwest Conservative Army, they all relied on a combination of commodities and trade as their local economies. They had no totalitarian sort of control over their economies because those were very, very decentralized fashions as it came to economic control. Of course, they had their own military forces in each faction that ascribed themselves to their faction and their leadership, but they were more decentralized in terms of their governing or their governance and how they conducted themselves on the economic level. So different systems would thrive in different areas under these last four remaining factions that I had mentioned there. Especially in the Union of Southwest Militias and the Northwest Conservative Army areas, those were very, very free areas because they mostly were all about local government. And local government means more freedom to do what you got to do to make it. And then the same, could be said of Maine and the Army of the Southeast, though, situations differed drastically due to the amount of combat and the smaller size of those respective factions areas versus the larger size of the Union of Southwest Militias areas and the Northwestern Conservative Armies areas, which had more room, which equaled more freedom because there was less combat in every corner of their territory, unlike the Army of the Southeast and the Maine militia forces in the south of Maine, which were basically just one big battlefront. But yes, that was the economic and financial systems of the different factions. Now I will discuss the other developments of the internal conflict. Basically, you had things such as the M0rm0n State. I mentioned their atrocities and how they the main atrocity I forgot to mention that they also engaged in, besides what they did to women, how they beheaded and executed people, and their suicide vehicles and their types of terrorist attacks and things. I forgot to mention that they did have limited instances of cannibalism, such as what occurred between the called by the faith forces who came from third world nations where there were fairly decently sized Mormon populations. Some of the called by the faith forces engaged in limited acts of cannibalism, but that put them on the map as far as what the enemies of them realized. When the M0rm0n State was fighting different enemies, that put that unit on the map, or that element rather, because it was different units of foreign volunteer forces called by the faith forces. That put them on the map, and they were known as cannibals, even though it was only isolated instances. But some of the backwoods beliefs that some of these third world people held was that they gained power from eating the organs of their enemies. So they were known, and that struck fear and horror into the enemies of the M0rm0n State, for instance. You also had Supreme Acolyte Josiah moving from his compound into the temple in the Salt Lake City Temple. He basically would lock himself in the Holy of Holies for hours at a time, sometimes days at a time, claiming he was communicating with God. Nobody knows. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but it wasn't the Christian God that he was communicating with. It was another God. But maybe he was just mentally ill. Nobody really knew at that point. But Josiah would go and lock himself in there and would come out hours or days later with a new edict to pass along to his subordinates, who would then in turn pass it along to the rest of the entire M0rm0n State. Different religious edicts, some held specific connotations, others did not. Sometimes it was just poetry. Supreme Acolyte Josiah was quite the individual by this point in the war, as he already began the war as a character, we'll just say. We'll just call him. Basically, he then turned the Salt Palace in Salt Lake City into a massive beheading center where audiences could attend if they like. And he would also do public floggings in there for the lesser punishments, for people that could still live but needed to be punished for violating Mormon laws under the new Mormon State, under the Council of Elders. When anyone would violate their laws, they were to be publicly flogged, and based on what law they violated would entail how many floggings they got. So they would be publicly flogged and scourged inside of the Salt Palace before civilian audiences. It would be like a spectacle, like an event. And sometimes mass beheadings would occur there too, of the regular criminals that violated severe Mormon laws that invited upon them the wrath of the blood atonement rite, which meant that they needed to have their blood shed to atone for their sins. Same with the they were foreign to them. The other factions, the rival factions who were captured in battle, who refused to convert, were force-marched to the Salt Palace, all the way in Salt Lake City, from wherever they were captured, to be beheaded. Only some of the captured prisoners were ever fully converted. Others were beheaded en masse in the Salt Palace and some other execution areas if it was just not possible to bring them to Salt Lake, but oftentimes that was where all the major Mormon state business of the faction was conducted, as it was their capital city. Much like Lincoln, Nebraska was the capital of the N.S.R.F, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, or Reno, the capital of the Union of Southwest Militias, or Oklahoma City, not Oklahoma City, what's that place? Well, Oklahoma City was like the political capital of the Free American Army, but the actual military operations center was the office of General Mathis, who conducted the coup and created the junta of leaders, and the one admiral in the reserves headquarters that was in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. That was where their military operations were conducted from, but they established political leadership under the Constitution, who was located in Oklahoma City, as it was seen as the safest big city away from hostilities to put their actual political capital. So they had, like, in a sense, like two different capitals. So basically, as far as that goes, that was the Mormon State. Now, when they conducted the biggest ever terrorist attack, what led up to that was there were two actual foreign terror groups that came to the Mormon State. They weren't under the Mormon State's chain of command, but the Mormon State let them in as honored guests, sort of like how Al-Qaeda was an honored guest of Mullah Omar. Well, there was a group called the Mormon Way and a group called the Mormon Martyrs Brigade, they were two different foreign groups, mostly comprised of European Mormons who were considered honored guests of the Council of Elders. And they were basically proxies by that point, used by the Mormon State, or allies of the Mormon State, rather, who entrusted them to carry out the biggest ever terrorist attack in all of world history. When they drove their camper van with a rigged up W-88 nuke into San Diego to hit the Gomorrahites of the regime in California and give them a blow that they would never forget. And thus they did, and they set it off, and San Diego was no more. In a split second, well over 1 million lives were vaporized when the city was turned to a flaming inferno, and it became ash. And the ashes carried away in the form of fallout and in the form of all the dead, vaporized people. Some of it blew out into the Pacific, and some of it blew back towards the Mormon State. That was the perhaps biggest atrocity that they ever committed, and used one of their proxies to carry it out. As their proxies were not easily recognizable. Now, one of these proxy groups was augmented by a Mormon community that was near Tonopah, Nevada, that had early on immigrated back to the Mormon State from Tonopah to answer Supreme Acolyte Josiah's calls to come to the Mormon State. However, being that there was originally a Mormon community, a sizable one near Tonopah, Nevada, they used that place and its people to be sent back as agents for the Mormon State, to be used as a sort of way station, if you will, for Mormon state attacks into the regime territory of California. It wasn't really known at first by any other factions that this was going on, but the proxy group was that drove the camper had used that location to fuel up for the long trip from Tonopah down to San Diego. They had to stop for fuel one time as they carried a large reserve tank that was built into the camper van to make their trip a lot easier without having to stop so much. In driving through the Great Basin forces, so long as it wasn't near the front, the territory of the Union of Southwest Militias forces in the large parts of northern Nevada inside the interior of the state were largely relatively small populated areas that did not have a lot of people to begin with, so there was not a lot of reason to keep large forces in those areas. So the Union of Southwest Militias was focused on the south and focused directly to the west against the regime, or in the direct east in small numbers in the Great Basin Desert against the Mormon State, who equally had small numbers as it was an inhospitable area. So it was easy for a lone individual camper van, unescorted, to drive through and stop one time for fuel in the Mormons' agents area in their former community at Tonopah, to then use that area as their way station for attacks, and then drive south and nuke San Diego, which they did to great effect. As for the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, although both the Mormon State and the regime relied on sarin and VX nerve agents, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front relied on chemical weapons more than anybody. They were known for their chemical weapons usage. Yes, they had nukes too from the seized at Warren Air Force Base, but they had not yet found the necessary pool of experts that were all in one area, like the Mormon State had readily available in Thule Army Depot, all in one area. They hadn't really, with their lack of fuel, been able to go searching for the experts and bring them all to one area immediately, which would take some time to get them to rig their own up. So what they did was, in the meantime, relied on their chemical weapons. Most of the chemical weapons were used against Chicago, the regime islands of Chicago, and against the regime forces in the Northeast, in Virginia, West Virginia, and the Carolinas, to great effect. In the South, it was harder to transport large quantities of VX or sarin to the front because the transportation networks by this point were so badly damaged, and the Mississippi River proved to be quite an obstacle for moving large logistical trains, be they actual literal trains or be they actual vehicle trains of trucks, through that area. Bridges were destroyed or damaged to where it was just impractical. And the train track was damaged too, of course, from sabotage, from fighting, from all kinds of things. Plus, the fuel was becoming more and more limited, so it was harder and harder to transport shells long distances. So most of the VX and sarin generally stayed relegated to the Northeast and upper Midwest primarily. Though small quantities did make it to the West, or very small quantities did make it to the south, to the Gulf Coast as well. But again, very, very small quantities. They hacked off limbs. The NSRF hacked off limbs. The NSRF, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, they also ran the mass hanging. First, it was public hangings. Public gallows, rather. They ran the gallows, the mass gallows. Then they started to move all of that stuff into the prison networks as Professor Albertson, the member of the Troika who ran the prison system, the economy, and the logistics, began to decide he wanted specialized extermination centers, and he wanted to make as many captives as possible march to their death. And they did, in the tens and tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands. As already many hundreds of thousands had been executed in these ways in public, but now we're on the field of battle too, as battlefield executions were common among the forces of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front in their quest to cleanse America of all its enemies. But they did begin to move these to the penal facilities that served as extermination centers. Mass starvation would be used too, as cells would become starvation cells where people would be locked in and starved to death until they began to hallucinate, with their only water being able to be drank, the toilet water in the toilets, as most of the sinks didn't work and there was only a small quantity of water in the toilet bowls. They basically would starve to death over a period of time, become bloated and burst open. And only then, when the stench became so bad, would the soldiers of the NSRF's death squads, now the prison guards too, open up the doors and clean it out somewhat. But they would never wash out the stains. They would just get the body out. They hooked up car batteries to genitals when they wanted to torture people, put them in stress positions, or hacked off their limbs and let them go as a testament to their brutality. They trained their young youth killers brigades in these prison systems by teaching them how to murder people in there so that they would become the best killers on the battlefield. As Alfred Motufu had stated in his meetings among the Troika, the other two Troika members, to which Colonel Albert, dang, hey, my phone's overheating, y'all. It's about to die. It's about to die. I gotta go. This is crazy. Yeah, my phone's overheating. It says it's overheating, so I love you all. I'm gonna get off. I have to finish this documentary on a 5th. Hey, my phone's overheating, y'all. I gotta go. It's overheating bad. Y'all be blessed.